next week's colloquium is entitled On the Cognitive Domination of the Black Colonized, Notes from the History of South African Social Sciences, and that will be delivered by our Mandela Fellow, Lwazi Lushaba. Today at the Hip Hop Archive at 5 o'clock, we'll have the second of our Du Bois lecture series delivered by Paul Lovejoy, entitled Equiano's World Beyond Slavery and Abolition. And just a reminder that Vision and Justice, a creative convening, will take place on April 25th and April 26th, and tickets and registration are available on the Radcliffe site. Now please welcome to the podium Ingrid Monson, Quincy Jones Professor of African American Music and of African American Studies.
Thank you. Well, I'm so excited to be here today to introduce Matthew, who I've known since he was a graduate student at Columbia University, and I've been following his career ever since. And just looking out into the audience, I see that you are a convener, because you brought together the music people, the African and African American Studies people. It's just a wonderful community who has turned out here to listen to you. He is an assistant professor at the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music, which is part of the Tisch School of Arts, right? And he is most known for his work on Black sound, which he will be talking to you about today. Morrison is one of the few scholars re-examining the history of blackface minstrelsy and placing it productively in dialogue with the development of copyright laws and the creation of popular music as an industry in the early 20th century. His work examines the racializing of sound, the sonic color line, and its implications for the commodification and circulation of Black music in the 20th and 21st centuries. Morrison studied violin and conducting at Morehouse College. He received his MA from Catholic University and his PhD from Columbia University. While there at Columbia, he served as editor-in-chief of Current Musicology, an absolutely wonderful journal that's edited by graduate students there. He's been published in the Journal of the American Musicological Society, the flagship journal of our field. And he's written a series of blogs on race and music for Oxford University Press that I'd like you to know about. One of them is about the Blurred Lines case. Another is about Iggy Azalea and appropriation. And yet another is on the amazing composer Julius Eastman. For 3 years, he served as Dean of Faculty for the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Princeton University, which is a summer program for high-achieving students of color, emphasizing scholarly development in conjunction with community building. He was a dazzling keynote speaker for the Harvard Music Department's Graduate Music Conference in 2017, which was called Black Lives Matter, Music, Race, and Justice. Morrison has also been involved in performance programs and organizations advancing the participation of people of color in orchestral performance, composition, and opera. He was the primary advisor for the Soundtrack of America concert series for the opening of New York's The Shed. He was also the primary advisor for the Glimmerglass opera Breaking Glass Forum, which toured 7 cities. I'm delighted that he's been at the Hutchins Center this year, and I know that he's been a fantastic colleague and interlocutor. His talk today is called Black Sound, Making Race and Popular Music in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Morrison.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ingrid, for that generous introduction. Again, as Ingrid mentioned here, I've known Ingrid since 2008 when I started my graduate studies at Columbia University, so it's really wonderful to come full circle here to have you introducing me as a fellow at the Hutchins Center. I really appreciate it. So thank you all for being here. My musicology colleagues, love you all are amazing. My Hutchins Center fellow colleagues, you all have turned into another level of family that I'm so grateful and thankful for. You really added to every part of my person, intellectually, spiritually, and otherwise. I'm very grateful that my mom is here, Miss Charmaine Morrison. Also an educator, came up from North Carolina to see her son. She always comes to visit on spring break. So luckily it coincided with my Hutchins Center talk. Now, we didn't plan that. Thank you very much, Krishna. My best friend is here all the way from LA. My dear sister, Imani Azuri, is here. I'm just very thankful for all the support that I receive from people who are very dear to me in my life. Very grateful for our great shepherd of Black Studies, the illustrious Professor Skip Gates, who I still have a problem calling Skip because of my Southern North Carolina AME upbringing, but I'll figure it out someday. Thank you very much to Abby, to Krishna, who just holds us down in so many different ways in the Hutchins Center, to Ms. Velma, the entire staff of the Hutchins Center as well. Thank you to Justin, who designed this very beautiful advertisement for me after I made it clear that I do not circulate blackface images in advertisement of my talks. And he came up with this really wonderful graphic here, as well as Jim and Tom for their assistance and help with the technical aspects of my presentation. So I think that I have done all of the protocol establishment, with AME, so this is how we have to do. So I'll hop right in to the talk at hand. Just to make clear and to be sure, there will be blackface imagery featured throughout this presentation. These are images of violence that continue to impact the lives and experiences of Black people. And so I want to make sure that we are tending to this even as I am engaging it in circulation here. I don't have to use this. Blackface minstrelsy is one of the most enduring cultural rituals in the United States. As the first original form of American popular entertainment, it began as a caricature performance of blackness in blackface, literally the blackening of one's face with burnt cork, by mostly Irish American and English actors. As blackface continued throughout the 19th century, actual Black people and their aesthetic practices began to more directly impact the aesthetics of blackface, as their virtuosity, which can never be truly contained, was still forced into limited scripts through popular performance. To be explicit, at the base of blackface is anti-Blackness, violence, racist caricature, and white supremacist ideologies that developed during the enslavement of Africans in the United States. This performance medium, steeped in violence, grew into the most ubiquitous form of American popular entertainment in the 19th century, as blackface's popularity paralleled the exponential expansion of slavery between 1810 and 1860. From the early antebellum period, through the Civil War, during Reconstruction and Redemption, through Jim Crow and civil rights, and persisting into the 20th and 21st centuries, blackface performance remains the aesthetic and material basis of identity and cultural formations in this nation, as it also laid the foundation for the economy of popular music. Through this concept of Black sound, which I define as the sonic and embodied aesthetics of blackface minstrelsy, I take seriously the task of unpacking the relationship between personhood, property, popular performance, race, and racism within the legacy of mass entertainment and culture in the United States. Because this presentation will feature the violence of blackface through images and sound, I would like to begin with a brief clip from a theatrical work titled Mr. Told E. Rance by choreographer Camille A. Brown, in which Brown addresses and attempts to subvert the racist legacy of the minstrel soul while attending to the aesthetics of Black performativity, as I hope to do within this talk. Now, what did I do with the clicker? Thank you. Rather than unpack Brown's work, I would like for this performance to linger throughout this presentation as I establish the relationship between blackface, black sound, and black performativity. I'll be happy to talk more about the meaning of this work in the Q&A. Black sound is the sonic and embodied legacy of blackface performance as the origin of all popular American music, entertainment, and culture. The concept functions as both a historical phenomenon and as an analytical tool. Black sound traces how the making of popular music, intellectual property relations, and the racialization of identity are tethered throughout the 19th century and beyond with the establishment of the commercial entertainment industry. As a historical concept, black sound unfolds as a dialectical process that traces the sounds of American popular music as it originated with white men performing in blackface in the early 19th century. The concept also specifically traces the ephemeral and material aesthetics produced by or attributed to Black Americans from slavery into the present. Unpacking the construction of race in the United States, Glenn C. Laurie suggests that we should, quote, see American slavery not merely as a legal convention, but also as a ritual custom defining and legitimating an order of racial hierarchy, end quote. Black sound reveals how the scripts performed in blackface have contributed to the ritual customs embedded into the construction of race, and how they materialized into what might be considered or dismissed as intellectual property within the making of copyright law and the establishment of the popular music industry out of blackface performance. Black sound also accounts for the legacy of violence embedded into the commercialization of popular music as black aesthetics become commodities taken into the body to freely express one's own personhood through consumption and performance in blackface, whether or not they have to carry the burden of being black under white supremacist structures. Black sound does not purport to stand in, however, for the myriad of complex and idiosyncratic sounds, of idiosyncratic black sounds, two separate words, produced by the diversity of black peoples in this nation, for I can never define the heterogeneity and power of black aesthetics and performance. As an analytic, black sound, again, one word, capital B, considers the systematic and property conditions under which popular music is produced, including the political, cultural, and legal parameters that shape how the performance practices of African Americans have been exploited through the development of intellectual property and modern copyright laws. In this presentation, I will consider the aesthetic legacies and property relations embedded into blackface by tracing its historical and structural relationship through the concept of black sound. The bodies and embodied knowledges of Africans in the New World have been a primary source of economic and cultural capital in the West since the transatlantic slave trade, beginning with the decontextualization of the ritual drum that was used to discipline captives into coffles as they marched to barracoons on the west coast of Africa, to the movements of enslaved peoples that were exploited on the deck of slave ships as they were coerced into dancing for physical maintenance, entertainment, and the often sexual exploitation of enslavers. The cultural aesthetics of Africans have served as a primary source of property for colonizers. Vincent Woodard's discussion of the taste and appetite that white Americans developed for the African American during slavery, literally as cannibalism and metaphorically as well, resonates within this study. As Woodard notes, quote, whites often satiated this taste and appetite for the African through acts of violence, sexual exploitation, imagined ingestion of the black, or through staged rituals designed to incrementally harvest black spirit and soul, end quote. Black sound points to how blackface performance developed as a ritual act that enabled both the embodied consumption and violent commodification of blackness under the guise of popular entertainment. The making of black sound intersects with both the transatlantic slave trade and the first property laws that were forged in this nation. The first federal U.S. copyright law was made in 1790 to protect maps, charts, and books for its citizens and all other residents in the United States for 14 years. Africans in America who were not deemed citizens were not afforded rights under these copyright laws. The revision to this first act came in 1831 and also included printed sheet music. In the next revision in 1856, dramatic works were protected, and in 1897, copyright law finally included the protection of public performance in the wake of mechanical reproduction technologies. It wasn't until 1976 that actual recordings themselves were protected under copyright law, And even then, the sounds on the recordings are not what fell under protection, but instead the recordings, the physical recordings themselves. Since the earliest this is how we get the whole crossover, or really the counterfeit performances of rock and roll that developed into rock proper in the 1950s and 60s, because the records themselves that were produced by black artists were not copyright protected, so they could be remade by white artists and sold to a larger popular audience, right? So I'll try not to do too many signs because I got a lot of text. So since the earliest of original American popular sheet music was printed with cover images after the 1831 Copy Act revision, Black Americans have been a material source of property in music, although they themselves and their creations were not protected under the law. So here we go with the racist blackface caricatures and images. Lithograph printing developed towards the middle of the 19th century, and this new technology shaped the emergence of popular sheet music and entertainment. It is notable that two of the earliest lithographic sheet music publications, as we see here, Master George E. Washington and General Lafayette from 1824, which is the first engraved sheet music with blackface, and the Log House from 1826, which is the first lithographic sheet music. And we can see the various representations of these images here. So it is notable that these two publications use black imagery, as blackness, both in a material and a performative sense, become a space for whiteness to see and construct itself as distinctly American and superior, even if the process involves, as Bell Hooks suggests, eating the other. Saidiya Hartman's formulation of terror and enjoyment is central to how I negotiate the relationship between person as property and the properties of performance in blackface. This dyad was developed in part to redress the dominant misconception of love and theft formulated by Eric Lott in his book of the same title, one that has left a lasting legacy on contemporary blackface studies. In Scenes of Subjection, Hartman notes that, quote, the desire to don, occupy, or possess blackness or the black body as a sentimental resource and or locus of excess enjoyment is both founded upon and enabled by the material relations of chattel slavery, end quote. Within a societal milieu of terror and enjoyment, intellectual property, or inventions of the mind, developed into a regulative concept of property under the conditions of chattel slavery as blackface as popular music, civic life, and racial identity were under construction. Intellectual property, henceforth IP, refers to creations of the mind such as inventions, literary or artistic works, designs and symbols, names and images used in commerce. The World Intellectual Property Organization was formed in 1967, and this specific definition of IP did not become widespread in the US until the 1980s. But the concept itself has been a part of how proprietary relations regarding people and their cultural productions have manifested in this nation since its founding out of slavery. Under the system of chattel slavery, intellectual property rights and copyright laws excluded black people and their rights to their own bodies and ideas, leaving them vulnerable to constant exploitation by those who could claim ownership over their person and anything that they produced. This included their cultural productions, or what I refer to as intellectual performance property, many of which developed out of oral traditions. The author, often white, male, and of a written text, as early copyright law was primarily formed around to protect books, became the main subject of how IP was imagined and continued to influence the making of copyright. Sheet music became the primary copyrightable material of music production. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry, y'all. And blackface minstrel tunes were some of the earliest and most popular commercial sheet music to circulate in the nation. Stereotypical representations of black people for a white public emerged through the performance and sheet music publications of the earliest popular blackface tunes, Jim Crow, Zip Coon, and Lucy Long. These stereotypes were often performed between acts of Shakespeare and other European theatrical forms as a comedic break or foil for the primarily white audience. So much of the popular entertainment that was geared towards sort of middle and upper class whites was drawn mostly from European imports in the United States. And so this is why I am presenting, and it's also historically understood, that blackface is the first original form of popular entertainment to be developed in this nation. As blackface developed almost 30 years after the invention of the cotton gin patented in 1794, which led to the great expansion of chattel slavery in the United States, and before sheet music itself was protected under copyright law in 1831, the entanglement between property and person increased for black Americans under the white gaze and white supremacist rule, marking what Cedric J. Robinson defines as the making of racial capitalism, a system of capital exploitation built upon slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. The majority of Black Americans in the U.S. has no structural control over how their bodies, personhood, or performance aesthetics were used or exploited for economic and political gain. As Black performativity was often enacted through orality, improvisation, and living intellectual performance practices, the ability for Black people to claim ownership over these aesthetics was even more precarious under slavery and the existing property laws that largely excluded them as people or citizens. The cover of Jim Crow's sheet music visually presents the black-faced character. First printed by early American publisher W.C. Peters, soon after Irish-American actor Thomas Dartmouth Rice jumped Jim Crow to great success in the late 1820s, the Jim Crow cover became one of the first lithographic images to introduce sheet music in early American popular music. Many of these stereotypes that became associated with Jim Crow's derisive character, the exaggeration, sexualization, and almost disfigurement of the character's body, his tattered clothing and appearance, angular movement and posture, and the character's blissfully unaware gaze, are evident in his misrepresentation on the sheet music's cover. Similarly, before audiences heard Rice and other blackface delineators, as they were referred to, jump Jim Crow in performance, they were first exposed through sheet music to the physical and gestural movements of this derisive archetype upon his appearance on stage. As the masked character entered the stage, the initial presentation of a blackened face and caricatural body posture added a level of artifice that encouraged the participants, whether via sheet music or in live performance, to internalize this archetype as an accurate portrayal of a Black other in relation to the free expression and construction of their white selves. The melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic basis to the music of Jump Jim Crow, however, are drawn directly from traditional Anglo-Irish folk tunes. The performance of these traditional sounds, now in the displaced land and performed in blackface, is consistent with the ways in which the performer embodied or becomes possessed by what was imagined as the freeing movements, gestures, and eventually sounds of Black Americans through the ritual of blackface minstrelsy. The embodied performance tropes of these blackface caricatures often included angular or broken posture, grounded or low to the ground movements, caricature of Black American dialect, and abnormal rhythmic performance. These things often contributed to views of primitivism and animalism among enslaved peoples, the sexualization of enslaved bodies, representing the enslaved as ignorant and uneducated, and also deviating from the standard or formal rhythmic practices attributed to the classical style of European-descended Americans. These scripts were effectively embedded into the white American imagination through early popular music and aesthetics, as both slavery and minstrelsy precluded the ability for Black performers to fully delineate or define or articulate what it meant to be Black in popular performance outside of blackface in the systematic supremacist system driven by white imaginaries. Blackface caricatures were often, I said white supremacy a lot in here, it's gonna keep coming too. Blackface caricatures were often viewed as ontologically Black or natural by their white producers and consumers, especially in the North where whites had some but limited contact with Black Americans. These ethnic white actors helped to structure within racist political systems what normal and proper performance looked like in the making of their own whiteness. Furthermore, these misrepresentations helped to frame how Blackness was perceived and constructed under racist regimes that limited their ability to define themselves under law and in popular culture. So Jim Crow might have sparked the watershed moment of blackface's ubiquity in the 1830s, but this figure was complemented very quickly by another stage character of early blackface, Zip Coon. Here we go again. If Jim Crow was to represent the slow, lazy, and dumb, quote, plantation darky in blackface, the Zip Coon stood in for the city and urban dandy, well-dressed, slick-tongued, and clever schemer, a sexual predator, and aloof. Although this character performed elements of high society through dress and presentation, the blackening of Zip Coon emphasized that he was indeed an obvious poser, naturally unable to achieve the civic and societal status of elites whites while being Black. This urban dandy might have appeared alongside and as frequently as Jim Crow in early minstrelsy, but unlike Jim Crow, the chorus that made Zip Coon a staple of blackface still survives today through the popular Irish folk tune known as Turkey in the Straw. As one of the earliest popular blackface publications, Zip Coon is a direct example of how black sound was both constructed within and embedded into American popular sound and identity. That's Turkey in a Straw, AKA Old Zip Coon, which is, again, an older folk tune from Ireland. So my book project gives careful consideration to how the impact of Lucy Long, a stereotyped character that was performed by white men in blackface and cross-dressed as a black woman, impacted black womanhood, heteronormative whiteness, queer performativity, femininity, and trans identity as we continue to contend with the stereotypes that emerged from the first enduring representation of black women on the popular stage in blackface. Significantly, Lucy Long's tune, like Jim Crow and Zip Coon, borrows again directly from Anglo-Irish folk songs. However, the performance of these stereotyped, cross-dressed black women caricatures, the lyrics, and the embodied scripts that develop from their stage enactment help to define the structural conditions that lead to the oppression, suppression, and foreclosure of the diverse lived experiences of black women and queer peoples across the spectrum of womanhood and femininity within a heterosexual culture, while making available tropes for white men and women to freely express their class, race, and gendered anxieties in performance. Many of the themes of the performances often express ridicule against the potentiality for black romantic love, or presented very specific stereotypes of black women as a, quote, wench, Jezebel, or mammy figure, just to name a few. The ability for black women and queer individuals to engage in what Jose Munoz terms disidentification, through which femme, queer, and trans individuals might perform the self in an effort to, quote, elucidate minoritarian politics that is not monocasual or monothematic, end quote, requires a constant redressing of the legacies left by these scripted blackface performances. Okay. As black sound developed both in and out of blackface, the stereotype stage persona, sheet music, writings about, and performance scripts of Jim Crow, Zip Coon, and Lucy Long began to stand in throughout society for the real lives of an increasingly freed African-American population throughout the antebellum urban centers, as well as those enslaved throughout the southern United States. Simultaneously, it created a space for the alignment of ethnic whiteness through popular sound and performance, with both economic and civic elevation under the unequal societal conditions that began in slavery and persist into today. So the spread of blackface in the 19th century, mid-19th century, coincided with the rise of mass political parties and mass circulation newspapers. These developments also overlap with mass immigration from North and Western Europe, particularly Ireland and Germany between the 1820s and 1870s. About a third of immigrants during this period to the US were from Ireland, and another third were from Germany. Blackface minstrelsy, a name that represents the formalization of early blackface performance. Again, these individual characters were often performed between acts of plays, but it formed into its whole entire, more formal theatrical production. And blackface minstrelsy became popular in the wake of European immigration to the United States, especially in the north and along the Ohio River Valley and Mississippi River. These recent Irish immigrants were often discriminated against by their white American, English, German, Ulster-Scot counterparts who felt that they were of lower and working class. It is not ironic, then, that as these poorer Irish Americans made their lives throughout urban centers in the north and along the Ohio River Valley, as they tried to assimilate themselves into whiteness against blackness, that they also became the primary progenitors of and earliest audiences for blackface. However, middle and upper class whites of various ethnicities, such as Stephen Foster, the father of American popular song, Dan Emmett, who helped to develop blackface into its form of minstrelsy, and Edward P. Christie, solidified minstrelsy as a popular genre, and these were all middle, upper class ethnic white men. They encouraged the commercialization of blackface in music halls, sheet music, and other mediums that laid the foundation for America's first original popular form of entertainment. Let's skip ahead about a century, and then we'll go right back. who became the first major film star, okay, after his breakout performance in The Jazz Singer, which is also the first the first feature-length film or talkie, which is a film synchronized with sound, from 1927. Joseph's performance in this 1939 film, Swanee River, is a commemoration of Edward P. Christie and his minstrel troupe of the mid-19th century. Christie's group became the most popular blackface troupe of the antebellum era. Significantly, E.P. Christie had direct ties to the Democratic Party, and George Harrington, Christie's protege who took over the troupe, was brother to 3-time Democratic Congressman Benjamin Wood, who later presided over the Democratic-led New York Daily News, which often promoted sort of, political propaganda around the Democratic Party. And his brother Fernando eventually became the mayor of New York. So I'm trying to make clear how tethered blackface performance and early popular entertainment in its original form is connected to politics from the start. Okay, so these things happening now are no surprise. The Christie minstrel secured from Foster to be the first performer of his works. Stephen Foster's blackface compositions such as Camptown Racist, Old Folks' Home, which we heard performed here by Al Jolson, and O Susanna, became theme songs of Westward Expansion and Manifest Destiny, as they also became some of the most popular songs performed and sold as sheet music in the 19th century. The sheet music of popular minstrel tunes in wide circulation during this era were geared primarily towards minstrel performers and an increasingly middle-class audience, and developing what Stephen Foster and what others are calling more sympathetic or genteel forms of blackface songs. That meaning that they're just less overtly racist, okay? And they also are drawing more or trying to engage more with these sort of parlor songs, ballad songs, operetta, opera, and other forms that, again, go into making a larger American popular style, but still imagined through the performance of blackness and blackface, okay? So furthermore, composers of popular music in the 19th century often did not hold copyright to their works. Foster died broke, okay? But instead, it was the publishers and printing houses that distributed the sheet music for sale. The establishment of the economy of popular music began in these moments. Stephen Foster and other 19th century composers hoped to make money off of royalties from sheet music sales, which typically increased after a song became popular through its performance. This is also where we get the early instances of plugging and marketing and using celebrities to do so, right? So Foster sheet music became popularized by troupes like E.P. Christie's Minstrels, again, the troupe that is being represented here in Swanee River, and Foster's Old Folks at Home, just to make this, just give you some numbers, sold an unprecedented 130,000 copies in 1854, at a time when 5,000 copies was considered a great success, okay? So we're talking about, again, the launch of a certain industry of American popular music directly out of this blackface legacy. Foster was paid, however, the music industrialists learned early on. I said I wanted to do a bunch of sides, didn't I? Foster was paid, however, a flat and often low fee by publishers who purchased and subsequently owned the rights to his works. An individual could copyright sheet music by 1831, but they could rarely afford to publish, print, and distribute it, right? But it was the developing publishers who maintained a monopoly on the rights to a composer's work really until the late 19th century and even until today. The internet messed them up a bit, but they still are finding ways through streaming services and otherwise to maintain a stronghold on the economic base of the popular music industry. So even still, the actual aesthetic basis of Foster and other white composers and performers, popular blackface tunes dialectically constructed black sound as they drew upon real and imagined black performance aesthetics that were not recognized as intellectual property. These popular blackface sounds and performances permeated the sonic fabric of the nation and directly impacted civic developments during the Civil War era, while the humanity and personhood of actual black people continued to be subjected or flat out denied by law and white supremacist structures. The conditionality of black being and black existence were shaped by the rise of Jacksonian common man democracy and ideologies during the antebellum era leading up to the Civil War. And these ideologies were championed by the nation's 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Jackson was an ardent supporter of slavery. He and the emerging Democratic Party played on the anxieties of poor and working class ethnic white men and their families for political gain. He functioned as an absolute ruler of his party's administration, and he did not defer to Congress or hesitate to use his presidential veto power at his behest. He was the poster child turned poster president of the Populist Democratic Party after defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans after the War of 1812. And he represented white men who did not own land, but who gained the right to vote after 1828, because prior to this, you could only vote if you were white and land owning, right? So his anti-Jeffersonian, and in this case, presented as anti-elite, right? Democrats, but Jackson, like Trump, were both rich as hell, okay? So his anti-Jeffersonian Democrats were made mostly of working and lower class white males and their families, many of Irish descent, striving to be a part of a system of whiteness afforded to wealthy white plantation owners and industrialists. Importantly, many, if not most, of the antebellum blackface producers and performers were directly affiliated with this party, and contemporary political themes of the time were frequently burlesqued on the minstrel stage. Stephen Foster and his well-to-do family from Pennsylvania were ardent Democrats, and Foster even campaigned and wrote songs for James Buchanan, the Democratic nominee who was elected president in 1856. As blackface and mass entertainment developed throughout the 19th century, however, both Republicans and Democrats participated and reveled in this form that dominated popular entertainment for over a century. So I'm trying to move through the different eras to show you about the continued legacy of blackface, and then we can get into what the contemporary ramifications of that is today. So during the antebellum era and after emancipation, blackface continued to lay the foundation for American popular culture and entertainment through the dominance of vaudeville, sheet music, and local music halls as the primary vehicles of commercial entertainment. It is noteworthy that more blackface troops featuring actual black performers, many of them called the Georgia Minstrels, enter into the picture between the 1850s and 1880s. This changed the game aesthetically for what then popular American music began to sound like, even as white imitators tried to incorporate these black performance practices directly from black minstrels who were performing counterfeit performances of themselves that white performers had done in blackface for already 3 or 4 decades, right? So it sounds messy because it is. Let's see here. So in the wake of blackface's proliferation towards the end of the 19th century, the International Copyright Act of 1891 was integral to the establishment of the commercial music industry and how black sound was commodified and continued to be embedded into the sounds and styles of American popular music. The act provided limited protection to foreign copyright holders in the United States, and it was especially designed for UK and US copyright holders to negotiate terms of fair use. So there's a reason that there's an exchange between the UK and the United States in terms of popular music and copyright laws as long as we can imagine, right? So prior to the adoption of the act, music publishing was decentralized and generally led by independent houses in urban areas throughout the United States. In the 1890s, with wide-scale urbanization and the development of recording technologies during the industrial era, the early popular music industry became centralized both geographically and stylistically, as Tin Pan Alley musicians formed the commercial music industry in New York City out of blackface and the continued commodification of black sound. This industry developed rapidly as the sounds and movements of black performers, both in and out of blackface, began to gain even more traction through styles such as ragtime and the blues, that were then copied, commercialized, and circulated mostly by white American publishers. The ephemeral and material performance tropes of black Americans that had laid the foundation of American popular music since the antebellum era were largely scripted, controlled, and owned, again, by white men of various ethnicities who established the emerging publishing, recording, and film industry and could claim a level of property rights through their scripting in sheet music and performance. So as the music industry continued to grow and become centralized through Tin Pan Alley, it also began to more clearly define an American general popular sound for its targeted customers, which was a constructed white working and middle upper class audience. M. Whitmark & Sons is one of the first and most successful American publishing houses in the United States who helped to construct Tin Pan Alley and the emerging modern music industry. The house was established in 1886 by Isidore, and they were young teens at the time, and his brothers Julius and Jay. But they established it under the legal name of their father, Marcus Whitmark, who had immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe. The brothers also became lobbyists for copyright and publishing policies as members of the newly developed Musicians Union, the Associations for Composers, Authors, and Publishers, also known as ASCAP. They largely established their brand through Black sound by marketing new styles, by marketing new styles, AKA sounds that were often taken from the margins of culture and commercialized into the popular sphere, like ragtime. So this is the normalized trend for how American popular music is constructed, you know, drawing from the margins and making it, you know, popular through its commercialization to appeal to a larger audience. So these sounds were written into popular sheet music and were based on the aesthetic and derisive performance tropes of blackface minstrelsy. Ragtime itself is both a style and a genre, and it is mostly generally defined as popular music that flourished from the mid-1890s to 1918. Its main identifying stylistic trait is its ragged, i.e. syncopated rhythm. It was invented by Black musicians on the margins of society, and this style was primarily cultivated in red light entertainment districts of urban centers through their performance in rare ragtime publications in the 1890s. While today, ragtime is most commonly thought of as a piano style, we could think that for the revival of Scott Joplin in the mid-20th century, during the ragtime period itself in the 1880s and 90s, the term also referred to other instrumental music, vocal music, and dance music. The coon song is one of the most popular ragtime mediums of the 1890s. Coon songs were popularized by mostly white composers and publishers who circulated ragtime styles through their published scripts. Coon songs are derived from blackface performance, usually in derisive and stereotypical Black dialect, and set to syncopated tunes and accompaniment. Often the sheet music presented a stereotyped blackface caricature that drew upon the images of early blackface publications like Jim Crow, Zip Coon, and Lucy Long from the mid-century. The coon song craze that swept popular music in the late 1890s took off in 1896, which is called the year of the coon song, which also happens to be the same year in which Jim Crow segregation was legally sanctioned through Plessy versus Ferguson, and it also incited the spread and commodification of Black vernacular styles through Black sound, most often without credit to its originators. So Daphne Brooks has a toned and amazing book called Bodies in Descent that speaks very clearly to the way in which Black performers had to inhabit and pushed against these blackface archetypes that existed, but still were creating and figuring out how to develop their own popular style that in the end was still usurped by the larger popular industry. So ragtime was also introduced to audiences who ventured from around the world to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, formally by performers like Scott Joplin, but even more importantly, informally by Black ragtime musicians at the halls of entertainment that surrounded the fair itself. Isaac Goldberg, music and cultural critic, who was a contemporary of Isidore Whitmark, one of the founders of the Whitmark Publishing House, posits a foundational connection between what I identify as Black sound and American popular culture in the following quote. "The Negro is a symbol of our uninhibited expression, of our uninhibited action. He is our catharsis. He is the disguise behind which we may, for a releasing moment, rejoin that part of ourselves which we have sacrificed to civilization. He helps us to do a double deliverance. What we dare not say, often we freely sing. Music, too, is an absolution. And what we would dare not sing in our own plain speech, we freely sing in the Negro dialect or in terms of the we here that Isaac Goldberg is referring to is we as white, okay? So as Goldberg notes here in his 1930 book, Tin Pan Alley, The Chronicle of the American Musical Racket, the investment in blackface persisted through Black sound as Tin Pan Alley composers and publishers blurred its minstrel mask, smoothed over the exaggerated scripts of blackface sound and movement that became commercially sold as ragtime, and began to freely express and base itself in a generically popular American sound that was aligned with whiteness. In From Ragtime to Swing Time, co-authored by Isaac Whitmark and Goldberg in 1938, the two state that, quote, "The more we learned about minstrel singers and the minstrel show that grew out of their activities almost 100 years ago," again, this is published in 1938, the more we realized that such shows contained both the fast and slow rhythms that were to come forth one day in the guise, respectively, of ragtime and blues. So these major figures in early American popular music are saying exactly what I'm trying to say now, right? So Whitmark states further that, quote, the minstrel show is one of the spiritual and material sources of Tin Pan Alley. Possession, ritual, all these things are themes that are going to be very central to how I theorize through what it means to take up blackness without having to engage with black people in a particular way through popular music and entertainment, because that, gets us beyond just appropriation as an analytic, right? So as highlighted by my project to capture the spirit of Tin Pan Alley, the origin of the popular music industry in the US is to capture the essence of blackface minstrelsy, a genre that was intended to capture the spirit of enslaved black Americans as well as their virtuosic aesthetics. Music industrialists, however effective they might have been in practice and in policy, repeatedly failed to capture the innovations of black intellectual performance practices, even as the industry persisted in its attempt, even through today, to capture black essence in the making and marketing of popular music. So in the close of my presentation, I'll close my presentation with a brief example that points to the persistent practices of the popular music industry through the case of the now ubiquitous popular tune, Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Die. The history of this song allows us to examine how regional vernacular sounds by black musicians became commodified, published, and disseminated through black sound in the establishment of Tin Pan Alley, American pop, and the shaping of racial identity. Oric Johns, who was the son of George S. Johns, at the time the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, retells a story from his father who recounted when Ignaz Paderewski, the well-known classical Polish pianist and composer, who later became the second prime minister of Poland, visited St. Louis. Paderewski had just completed a recital and sought diversion during his visit in 1891. Tell me, asked Paderewski, is there anything novel, anything out of the ordinary, a trifle bizarre to be seen in St. Louis tonight? Yes, there's Babe Connors, said Johns. Everybody sees Babe Connors sooner or later. Babe Connors imported the pick of girls from Louisiana. This is drawn from the story that was told in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And Mammy Lou, she seems to be generally known as Mama Lou, a gnarled black African of the purest type, sang with her powerful voice a great variety of indigenous songs. Paderewski went to Babe Connors, and after a very informal and polite introduction, a dozen beauties danced to the music of a blind pianist, and Mama Lou sang her rocker songs. Among them was Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Die. It was still unknown to the wide world, and it caught Paderewski's fancy. He went to the piano and asked her to sing it again and again. He learned that in a number of songs from her, and in a season or two, the song, like many others that originated with Mama Lou, got into vaudeville by way of some manager who visited Babes and became a sensation. So while Western classical music was culturally associated with high or European-descended white culture, popular music was connected to black, poorer whites of various ethnicities, and other people of color of working and lower financial classes. These are the ideological split between highbrow and lowbrow, right, that we still operate within. So this imagined and ideological cultural division, however, as evident by this exchange between classical and popular styles of music, is challenged by this anecdote. Paderewski, the Western classical pianist, one of the most famous of his time, and composer, ventured to St. Louis's red light district for novel entertainment at Babe Connors Castle, one of the most popular venues of popular entertainment in the nation at this moment as well. So we have actually the overlap of high and high. Sarah Babe Connor herself, the owner of the castle, which the entertainment hall was referred to, was born into slavery in Nashville, Tennessee in 1856 and attended Fisk. Soon after being freed from slavery, after emancipation by her father, who was also the plantation owner, Sarah Babe Connor moved to St. Louis and later around 1890 opened her famous sporting house known as the Castle. Paderewski's described fascination with Mama Lou, whose name was Leticia Lula Agatha Fontaine, and she was from Santo Domingo, and his fascination with her performance highlights this tension that emerges with the widespread transmission and regulation of regional vernacular sounds of black performers, specifically a woman in this case, who were denied access to their own intellectual performance properties by structural design and white supremacy. Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da, first a regional popular song performed and created by Mama Lou, traveled from a local black-owned sporting house to becoming the subject of a copyright case in 1932. Henry J. Sayers versus Sigmund Spaeth et al. In the case, the district judge decided that aside from a couple of new verses, that the song and melody itself belonged to the public domain because of its ubiquity. We ain't done yet, but I almost am. Henry J. Sayers, the first to publish Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da as sheet music in the United States, noted himself that the melody originated in a performance that he heard by Mama Lou at Babe Connor's castle. These folks were not trying to deny, the origins of where they heard because they knew they could claim ownership over them in real time under copyright laws, right? So many other songs are attributed to originating in at Babe Connor's castle by Mama Lou, like A Hot Time, which became a popular song of the Spanish-American War. Like, there are so many songs that she produced that went on to become major popular sensations. So what allowed these regional vernacular sounds to become a sensation during the 1890s were not just the sounds themselves, although they are key, but the packaging and marketing of these sounds into sheet music for consumption and performance by a larger audience, and the inability for most black musicians to publish and receive royalties or to claim property rights over their own works. Because black performers in red light venues had limited access to the developing publishing rights and presses of the music industry, especially under Jim Crow and other US racist systems, white music industrialists saw an opportunity to capitalize on the novelty of black vernacular sounds by transcribing them onto sheet music, thereby claiming authority to manipulate, own, and distribute black sound as the basis of the popular music industry in the 1890s. Although Henry J. Sayers copied Mama Lou's Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da in his blackface variety show, so again, Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da found its way into a essentially vaudeville show, which was staged in blackface by this composer Henry J. Sayers, who made it clear that he heard this originally at the castle, right? So he created this blackface variety show called Tuxedo between 1890 and 1891. However, the song did not immediately achieve nationwide popularity. Its fame was to be left up to a performance by British music hall entertainer Lottie Collins. The musician actress performed Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da in London theaters after her husband heard the song in Sayers' blackface review in the early 1890s. Her husband then purchased the rights to publish this song in London. This is one of the images. There are many versions of Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da published in the UK and the United States. I chose this one because it shows Lottie Collins and the movements associated with the performance itself, which are also connected to a certain style of French cabaret dance at the time, right? So once this then lesser-known entertainer returned to London in 1892 and performed Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da, the song, the dance, Lottie Collins' can-can high kicks, and Collins herself became a sensation in London's burgeoning popular music halls. So almost 30 years after Mama Lou performed this soon-to-be viral Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Da at Babe Connor's Castle in St. Louis, Henry J. Sayers, again, who originally copied this song in his 1890 variety blackface show Tuxedo, went on to publish a 1919 version of this song in the United States that sold over 1 million copies. Importantly, this popular song and sheet music was copyrighted by Sayers after the first major revision of the US copyright laws in 1909. The Copyright Act of 1909 granted a more comprehensive protection for originally published works against unauthorized reproduction, and it also protected against the unauthorized mechanical reproduction of a musical composition without the consent of its owner. Although the song's popularity and style developed through various levels of interaction between white and black musicians, the origins of its syncopated, improvised, and corporeal vernacular scripts of black American performance practices were erased through their commodification by the growing industries of music and entertainment in the United States and the UK. Thus, by the time the song was deemed to be public domain in the court case, its emergency within the history of black sound had receded into the basic sounds associated with white American popular entertainment and rarely attributed to its originator, Mama Lou, who never received royalties for her original work. Black sound continued to shift and develop with the growth of the popular music industry, and it, along with blackface, became the medium through which marginalized white Americans, women, black Americans, and other people of color would enter into the music industrial complex that developed into the American popular music industry. Tin Pan Alley publishers and some composers like the Whitmark and Sons became the lobbyists for music unions that developed during this time. Furthermore, many of these composers and performers who began in Tin Pan Alley, which again directly developed out of blackface aesthetics and economics, dominated the emerging US mega industries of entertainment with the growth of radio, recordings, and film in the mid-20th century. Almost every genre of popular entertainment can be traced to have an origin directly, materially in blackface, okay? Furthermore, Birth of a Nation, Amos and Andy, I mean, like everything. Furthermore, many composers and performers, they also heavily influenced how modern copyright laws were shaped. Black sound traces and reveals how the racialization of sound and shifting notions of intellectual property throughout the 19th century and into the 20th informs how popular music is a space to hear, see, and interrogate the circulation and commodification of black performance properties. These performative aesthetics, or the intellectual performance property of African Americans, serve as the ephemeral and material basis of the music industry and identity formations. Black sound takes seriously the structural conditions of racism, discrimination, and exclusion that black Americans have historically and continue to face, even as their cultural innovations and intellectual performance traditions remain foundational to the economy of popular entertainment in and beyond the United States. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you. That was fabulous. As you know, I have to run, but I wanted to ask you.
Please.
How did Cole and Johnson, the Johnson brothers and Cole?
Absolutely.
You know, I used to sing Under the Bamboo Tree.
Yes.
In elementary school.
Yes.
And I was a student at Yale when I found out that black people I almost had a heart attack. Explain, because they were extraordinarily successful.
Absolutely.
So explain, they seem to be going against the tide.
Yes, yes, yes.
And then going to ask Ingrid if she would take over, field the question.
So thank you for that question, Professor Gates, because one of the things that I'm trying to make explicit in this presentation and in this work is that blackface, because it was so ubiquitous and because it was the primary form of American popular entertainment, this was the way in which almost everyone who entered into popular music had to find their way through blackface first. So we're even talking about white women coon shouters, right, who gained access to the popular stage. It was first through blackface singing blackface songs. So also, again, as I mentioned, so we have someone like William Henry Master Jubilain, who was early as the 1840s, a black man from Rhode Island who is known as the inventor of modern tap, was already pushing against, you know, these limited scripts that were being placed onto black bodies through popular performance by inserting their own virtuosity into these spaces, right? So, but that also still does not remove the actual systematic structures of supremacy that define how they enact, and you know, how they actually have to live. Right. But to go specifically to thinking about Bob Cole and Johnson, Ernest Hogan, Burt Williams, I mean, there's just a whole host of these black performers who had to inhabit blackface because, one, it was the most lucrative medium through which they could actually gain financial success to then be able to produce other things that were not blackface proper, right? And so, but then what happens is that there's just this really messed up, you know, situation. I guess it's a paradox in some way that as they always, Nobody, 1909, Ernest Hogan. For some reason I'm blanking. It's Ernest Hogan. No, it's Burt Williams. Burt Williams is Nobody in 1909. I could play a clip of that where essentially this is one of the most popular songs in that year. And it's a coon song, right, where he's essentially singing about nobody cares anything about him. It's still using blackface dialect, but it's incorporating many more sort of black localized aesthetics that still in a popular sense can be read, depending on who's listening to it, right, as a part of the same minstrel tradition. But the actual performances themselves then begin to impact other sort of variations of popular music that come out of it. So there's always this back and forth between sort of a pushing against the scripts that are placed upon one through blackface, while also still essentially the creations that you're giving up, because they're not considered to be aesthetically property, are then still absorbed into the larger popular entertainment machine, right? So there's always, for me, this back and forth that happens. But as I mentioned in the earlier part, black aesthetics can never be contained, and that's where there's always, the music industry is shifting around innovations that come from these communities until today. Yeah.
Well, I'll just
Ingrid,
continue, because I think there's a couple really important interventions you make. One is defining black sound as this hybrid space, okay, and that becomes ritually enacted. That is something different than what real black sound is.
Absolutely,
okay?
yes.
And the second is really looking closely at this history of sheet music publishing, where the black sound without the space is what then becomes the basis for the music copyright.
Absolutely.
And then claiming, and so the white publishing companies claiming copyright on this, that then later down the line, once the 1909 Copyright Act happens, becomes the basis for these lawsuits. So
Absolutely.
this is the moment, and you look at it before recording. My question would be to you is then your analysis of where recording in this comes into and where you take the story from there.
Absolutely. So thank you for that question, Ingrid. So the book itself, I am doing my best to, it's essentially working up to the recording era. Because one, there's some really great work out there on early recording and the racialization of the different styles that develop in the early recording industry. But I'm also trying to point to how even recordings, in a way, how we imagine, we imagine a certain level of fidelity and realness, right? But also how the recordings themselves are concoctions and constructions of aesthetics that, in some ways, haven't actually been understood as. Actually, let me come back on that. I'll start specifically with the emergence of hillbilly music and race records, right? And so that really kicks off the popular recording industry, but we also know that the race records, Ma Rainey, and we know that they were the race records themselves were very much constructed by an industry that were combining vaudeville, operetta, the blues, ragtime into these different aesthetics, but also that is, to me, coming out of how black sound had already, again, this sort of back and forth between a constructed notion of what popular music was and the actual aesthetic practices that went into it. By that time, when they're recorded, it's easily to actually target and market these recordings to very specifically racialized audiences, and then also to recognize certain sounds and markers as belonging to particular people. So I think this gets us to even how, the Lil Nas conflict of, this being country music or not being country music, when in fact, country music itself is a fabrication and a construction that very specific, aesthetic sounds were, the twang, or or yodeling or such, these things were specifically, while they were part of a performance tradition, they were also taken up by music industrialists, as you know, to say that, oh, these are the sounds that belong in this genre because this genre is marketing to these particular people because we can sell it to them based on these racialized understandings and aesthetics, right? And so there are ways I think that I'm trying to point to again, while I keep referring to the ephemeral and material aspects of pre-recorded sound that impact directly how we imagine what we hear on the record as being, part of a, fidelity of representation of identity and also a particular aesthetic,
Yes, absolutely. Yes. We could go on and on. Who would like to ask a question next?
Hello?
Yes.
Matthew, thank you. That was so fabulous. And I have so many thoughts and questions, but I'm going to try to keep it to one.
Please.
I really love what you're doing here, and I just see how, it's resonating and building on, say, the work of Stephen Best and Fugitive Properties, but also of Professor Gates and The Face and Voice of Blackness.
Yes.
And I'm particularly interested for you to sort of theorize and think with us the visuality of Black sound.
Okay.
Because that's so kind of key, and the visual is so key to kind of blackface. So
Yes.
I would just love to hear your kind of ruminations and to hear what thinkers have been mattering to you as you've navigated that.
Yes.
And then I'll just say a small comment. I'm sure you know, but for the television show, The Cleveland Show, Kanye West does a cover of
Tarara Boom.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, yes, Tarara travels all over the place. You know, I do. You know, my musicology colleagues of mine have heard me do other versions of this presentation where I talk about how Tarara becomes like one of the theme songs of the Stonewall riots.
Yeah.
Right. But it's totally decontextualized. I had a musicology colleague who told me at a conference that Tarara Bundi was also a song that during, or like sort of at the fall of apartheid was used and within Afrikaans like became, the sound itself became sort of like a chant, right? So it's all over the damn place. Mamalu, yeah. But to your question around the visuality and the visual aesthetics, I feel like much of the work that is done on blackface often focuses on the visual aspects of it, and so that's why my work is so focused on the sonic and aesthetic aspects of it, right? But I think that thinking of like spillers, right, and inscribing onto, the skin and flesh. There are ways that the sounds themselves, and so Nina Eidsheim, who is a musicologist, writes quite a bit and thinks through what it means for us to imagine the voice to be naturalized or racialized in a particular way, instead of understanding the voice as an actual and literal construction itself, just like identity, right? So I think that blackface becomes a way for those two things to be collapsed visually and sonically, where what we see, we also expect to hear something particular. And so, you hear me talking down the street, you already start to guess who and what I am, right? Man, is he black? Is he educated? Like all these things, right? And so, but then I think that the damage that the visuality of blackface does is that at the base of it, it dehumanizes the ability for even for someone who may look like one of these figures, right? There is nothing wrong with a particular look. What is wrong is what the meanings that are inscribed onto those looks that then become to replace actual people who exist. Right. You know what I mean? And so I don't know if that.
No, I think that's actually great. And I think one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking, you made reference to the cannibalistic.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if maybe vampirism might be a more apt kind of metaphor for this kind of continual extraction, which wants the thing to stay alive, but then to be able to take up its properties.
Come on, Huey. Yeah. Listen, hold on, let me get my. Yes, we will be talking about that. Thank you. Kay.
Yes. Whoa, that's very hot. I'm coming at this from a really selfish perspective because I kept on noticing London.
Yes.
I kept on noticing how important England was in this process.
Absolutely.
And I was hoping you could develop a little bit more a sense of North Atlantic Black sound as opposed to it being exclusively within the United States.
Yes. Thank you, Kay. So because of the scope of, the project could go in so many directions, right? And I feel like one of the chapter that I'm writing on William Henry Master Jubilee deals with these cross-Atlantic connections because, so just to be explicitly clear for everyone around here, blackface is the first popular export to the rest of the world of music out of the United States, originally, right? So as far as Japan, Australia, so anytime any country says they have no relation to blackface, they're lying, okay? There absolutely is a relationship to these things. But Kay, in the book, what I'm trying to do in the chapter on William Henry Lane is to show the development of these reciprocal copyright laws between the United States and the UK that also map the traveling of performers and music back and forth that really begins, so we were heavily importing, European and performance and music from London in the first place. But then we began to send back through blackface, right? And it becomes an exchange at that point that I do try to, at least in that chapter, theorize through a bit, but selfishly, for my own self, I'm focusing very much on the United States because there's so much to it aesthetically and sonically that really hasn't been attended to as much.
It seems the racial ideology in the UK is so different.
Yeah.
Our race problems are not their race problems.
Right.
They have them.
Yeah.
But you can still find pickaninny dolls at markets.
Absolutely. Gollywog dolls in France. Just all the everything. Yes.
And they use those words in just
Yes. And I think that thanks for that, Kate, because I think that there are many ways to think about the way, again, that these material and ephemeral ideas of black aesthetics are taken up to then reconstruct and imagine one's own national white or whatever identity is, depending on your locale. You know, and then we can trace this all the way up to the spread of blues, R&B, and all these things in the UK and Liverpool, where they act like they're, you know, I mean, it's the home of the slave trade in the UK, but they act like, you know, oh, where did these sounds come? There's long relationships in histories, right?
Yeah, so that was marvelous, amazing. So my question goes to this idea of cannibalism and specifically how black sound has traveled to places like Cuba, for example.
Yes.
And how, like, if you can sort of give a bit more insight into how you feel these cannibalized sounds then travel to these countries and then are basically have responses that we think are authentic, and we respond back with, you know, sort of local forms of hip hop.
Yes.
We think it's transnational music, but then really this is basically cannibalized music that we're just basically digesting from above, in a sense.
Absolutely,
or
Pablo.
If that makes sense.
It makes total sense. So one, I'll defer. I would like to refer to my colleague Danielle Roper, who is writing a book on blackface in Latin America, which is like in the next year or so should be coming out. We spent some time together at a workshop in Chicago this past weekend. But so one of the things that I'm trying to make clear within the definition of black sound is the potentiality for the violence embedded into the circulation of particular sounds and images that may or may not be understood properly, right, within a context. And then also ones that have been like overtly racialized to delimit it to very specific or singular, you know, aesthetic representations, you know. So then I think what happens, and so we can, I mean, in Cuba, you know, the zarzuela, right, which happens in the early 20th century, but it's coming from a genre in Spain. And so we're talking about where, like, you know, the Cuban middle class is being pandered to by women in blackface on the stage who are trying to sort of create a Cuban national identity vis-a-vis blackness, even though they're not wanting to actually engage with, you know, the blackness happening in Cuba at the same time. So it's easier to draw from these tropes that have already been so specifically scripted to mean a particular thing over time, you know what I mean, to then sort of, I think, try to create whatever.
I'm referring to hip hop more, like.
So you want to think about the hip hop? Okay. Present day urban music. Yeah.
Well, we have urban music in Havana.
Yeah.
Is that really out of the black sounds?
Yeah.
Schema, basically.
So, you know, there are two things. So, you know, black sound, one word, capital B, and black sound with the space, right? And so, you know, within Cuba, they are creating black sounds, right? And they are also engaging with black sounds from black people, right? But then we're also talking about the transmission of very particular sounds that come, you know, so Pablo, for those who don't know, is like one of the originators of Cuban hip hop, okay? Just to be clear about this. Okay, listen. But you know, so by the time that hip hop travels to Cuba, you know, we can look at when it travels and what hip hop is making it there, right? So then we trace it back to the actual sort of industrial making and marketing and tooling of that particular brand of hip hop, and then trace
the cannibalizing of what the reality of black sound is here.
And then trace back from that to see what the actual aesthetic parts of that make up that particular sound that travels to Cuba, and then also what the sort of ideological implications and expectations are of that, you know, of that limited sort of access to a particular style that travels. So if we're talking about, you know, hip hop, when it becomes like a larger commercial form out of gangsta rap, right? These very specific notions of what a black hip hop sound is become the dominant strain for how hip hop and blackness is imagined, right? Well, we know that there are just multiple forms of hip hop that existed that were just not along that one particular, and even that itself is heterogeneous. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
No, and then you okay.
Oh. I don't get to ask my question? Oh, okay, good.
Please go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead. Okay, thank you. I'm just swirling. My mind is swirling. It's a brilliant talk, a brilliant research. Yeah, so I guess it's like I'm thinking about, you know, the black vernacular sound that was coming from the real black bodies, that was the real sonics that were happening for black people, black Americans. And then I'm thinking about Fist Jubilee singers who do a concertized version of their own sound, and then they spread that around
Yes.
when they travel around the world singing that. And then I'm just wondering about when we think of that trajectory of like in the ways that Black people were making their actual Black space sound
Yes.
on this continent. But I'm thinking about, I'm just wanting to know, like, how does this impact, because your work is very much dealing with what was happening at that time, which was a very much white and Black kind of dichotomy. But at this point, we understand that people all over the world of different ethnicities, of different cultures,
Yes.
cannibalize, as you were saying, what they call a Black sound.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested in that, not to mention what you taught me the word coonshot, if we think about people like Amy Winehouse. When you hear what she sounded like before she started embodying this idea of Black sounds, or Adele, who studied Ella Fitzgerald and our at last the great Etta James. So I'm just interested in like the trajectory that we're in now, because this foundation is so troubling as a vocalist composer for myself, and also the ways that we don't have space to even be ourselves sometimes, because if you're not Black, then you get to be all of whatever Black sound is, or Black space sound plus Black sound.
So it's messed up, right? But so one of the things that I think I will do more in the book is try to point to what it means for these sounds to actually circulate. You know what I mean? So like circulate along routes, circulate through sheet, so like the postal system impacted how sheet music proliferated in a way, because then it could reach, folks in certain ways. You could get sheet music, going across the world in different ways. And then also when radio waves happen. So there are a lot of ways that I think these sort of limited scripts that are constructed over time are also, like, I think a Black sound is along a continuum. And so the actual aesthetic parts that are about it, are Black space sounds, but they are also a culmination of we don't live, even if we live in segregated spaces, we're still interacting and engaging, especially like when we get into certain types of technology with many people and many other things. And so if I think about even blackface on the West Coast, right, in San Francisco, it was huge in the mid-19th century, because we're talking about westward expansion, right? We're also talking about, a clear relationship, the subjection of, Chinese workers, on the West Coast at this time as well. And so we have early on in blackface, white, performers performing ideas of Asianness, right, in blackface at the time. And so they are creating and limiting scripts from what they imagined as a certain, again, I'm using all these things in quote, Asian Oriental sounds through this sort of blackface facade, as they're also, limiting, I guess, in a lot of ways, what certain popular sounds can be understood and attributed to, those very same peoples, right? I don't know if I'm answering the question there.
It's good. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, but we'll talk, we'll talk about it. Yes. No, please.
Thank you so much for this talk. Being from Ghana, where blackface is still performed to this day at concert parties, I feel like I learned so much about the origins and how the styles and aesthetics traveled in a way. I'm actually also really fascinated, though, by the kinds of descriptions of bodily comportment that you put up there.
Yes.
Primarily because reading them as a historian of psychiatry, I immediately turn to catatonic schizophrenia. These are types. He says uninhibited. A psychiatrist would say not goal-oriented.
Yes.
So I started to think, what are the kinds of sort of cultural in that moment, mid to late 1800s to the early 1900s, sort of psychological scripts that black people are placed into,
right?
And how that shapes the music and the sound.
Yes. I'm not sure if I can specifically answer about the psychological shift, because I try to stay in my lane. but what you're saying very much resonates to me. So I'm thinking about how the cakewalk craze became like a worldwide sensation at the turn of the 20th century, right? So much so that in Vienna, they were like, listen, can we get back to the damn waltz? We're tired of the cakewalk. Like it was that popular among, you know, elite and rich folks throughout Paris, you know, throughout European cosmopolitan centers, right? As it traveled from them, I mean, they were having huge cakewalk competitions in Madison Square Garden, right? But as we know, the cakewalk derives from a parody of a parody, right? And so you have, you know, black folks, enslaved folks who are parodying, you know, these waltz dances, you know, partner dances where they're, you know, spaced apart from each other. But the cakewalk then is developed sort of in relation to imbuing their own sensibilities into these rigid styles. And so we see that the cakewalk becomes, in some ways, reflexive of the way that some of the images are presented. So, you know, again, like I said, like low to the ground, right? Kicks, you know, bending backwards, high kicks, you know, partners that were no longer sort of distance from one another, but like close to one another, you know, doing very, you know, independently, well, improvising, you know, in real time in dance along with the partner and things, again, that were not part of these sort of more normalized, scripted components of what, you know, more formalized dance attributed to white Americans, Europeans look like. And so I think that there's a way to answer your question or to even think about, you know, what are sort of the psychological scripts that are written onto the bodies through movement and sound and dance, right? That they are overwritten to me, right? And so a movement of one shuffling one's feet, being lowered to the ground, or being sort of not in a what is considered to be a proper bodily posture is decontextualized from a particular like cultural performance that is part of that movement practice, but then is able to be read against a more standardized, formalized, you know, proper notion of movement that then is connected and I think aligned with whiteness and citizenship and properness and all these things, right? And so I guess what I'm suggesting here is that there's a way that I guess the psychology of these movements is an overriding. I guess I'm thinking of phenomena, right? Like riding over onto what one already understood as themselves, and then has to reflect back and be like, wait a minute, so this is I'm a Negro, you know what I mean? So I think that's as much as I got. So I would deal with it. Yeah. Hello.
Is this working? Here we go. So as I'm a historian who teaches the second half of the U.S. survey, and your talk really shows just kind of how ridiculous it is that we sort of assume we can start at 1877 and, you know, it's like day one, everything happens from here. So, you know, taking that broad perspective, your talk really shows how important that is, and I really appreciated that. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about the implications of your research here for conversations throughout the 20th century about authenticity and cultural authenticity.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. And so, I keep saying in the book project, clearly I'm working on a book, huh? In the book project, there are a lot of ways that I try to enter into and unpack the meaning of aesthetics, right, and how aesthetics get mapped onto ontology or some imagination of what it means to be in any sense. And John Jackson theorizes through authenticity and sincerity as as sort of complementary in imagining how we think about identity construction. And so authenticity becomes, for me, and again, thinking through Jackson, it's about these scripts, you know, that are, and I'm drawing scripts from Glenn C. Laurie and from a larger history of thinking about the sort of, I guess, delineating what one's like identity traits could be. But I think that the idea of authenticity in relation to performance and in relation to the larger sort of aesthetic basis of blackface is also about how certain movements or sounds become recognized as, rather than authentic, recognized as belonging, you know, to a particular person or to a particular body, and that belonging also has to do with the structures and systems that allow or enable them to be anything else, right, or don't allow them to do so, right? And so what Jackson and so this is probably one of the things I'm working through very carefully, is that so it's not even just that, you know, there are scripts that we expect people to perform, and if they don't, then you know, they're not authentic. there are also other types of performances, and as he just his sincerity of like, what is it, like how are they emotionally convincing someone that what they're doing is somehow specifically related to them and that they can exist in that way? And does that carry any less or any more sort of power in how they're then read in a larger structural sense, if that, that makes sense?
Well, this has been amazing and fantastic. We've reached the witching hour of 1:30, in which we can continue talking more informally. But thank you so much, Matt. You've given us, we can't wait for the book.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.